Welcome to Renegade Inc. The horrific events have been extensively documented, but not until now has the corporate sponsorship of the Holocaust ever been methodically laid out. Rarely do we hear that it was corporate interests coupled with desk-bound administrators that drove one of the most abhorrent chapters in human history. Joining me to discuss the desk killers in history and today is the author of I, You, We, Them, Dan Gretton. Dan, welcome. Thank you very much for coming by.
Thanks for inviting me.
Dan, occasionally you come across a book of this size and calibre, and it's certainly taken me aback. And John Berger says on the quote on the front, great books never occur out of the desire for greatness, but often out of a possessed persistence in the face of a chosen and immensely difficult task, and this is such a book. Congratulations on it.
Thank you.
You, we, them. And the tagline, which is most instructive, Journeys Beyond Evil, the desk killers in history and today. Desk killers. What's a desk killer?
Well, it comes originally from a German concept, one of these really long German compound nouns, Schreibtischtäter,
right,
which literally means desk perpetrator. But that's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
So really, one of the reasons for writing this book is I want to get this term, the desk killers, into public discourse.
Why?
The origin of the term was at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961. And Eichmann was probably the archetypal desk killer in one way, the organizer, the bureaucrat, who very rarely left his office in Berlin, but was responsible for killing hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And if you think about the way corporations work today, if you think about the hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are being killed through essentially people typing from their desk or sending memos or sending emails, it's such a potent concept. And it is amazing to me that this is the first substantive book that has ever been written on the desk killers.
And is it the depersonalised nature of that individual who will send emails and whatever it might be, words around the world? Those words have actions, and ultimately what you're saying is there needs to be a responsibility for that process.
Totally, absolutely. But I mean, the origin of this work, it's been a massive project. It's about 22 years since I started work on the ideas behind this book.
But there must have been a sort of genesis moment, because we can talk about the depersonalisation and desk killers, but where did all that start? What's the historical context to this? And was there a light bulb? Was it Eureka?
There was a light. Well, there were actually three light bulb moments.
Right.
And the first of those three was when I was 22 years old, early 87, and I spent 2 days completely mesmerised in a cinema in central London, the Curzon Cinema, watching Landsman's film, 9.5-hour film on the Holocaust, which blew me away. And I still think it's one of the most extraordinary films ever made, certainly the most important film ever made about the Holocaust. And there was one part of that film which went... And it was this memorandum being read out by Landsman. And it's basically an entirely bureaucratic, almost corporate language. And the words, going through it, the words are, since December 1941, 97,000 have been processed by the 3 vehicles in service with no major incidents. However, in the light of observations, the following technical changes are needed. The normal load is 9 per square metre.
Dans les voitures horaires, qui sont très volumineuses, l'utilisation maximale de l'espace n'est pas possible, non pas à cause d'une surcharge éventuelle, mais parce que le chargement à la capacité maximale aurait des répercussions sur la tenue de route du véhicule. Une diminution de l'espace de chargement paraît donc nécessaire. Il faudrait absolument réduire cet espace d'1 mètre au lieu de chercher à résoudre le problème comme on l'a fait jusqu'à présent, en diminuant le nombre des pièces à charger. Ce dernier procédé a le désavantage d'entraîner un temps de fonctionnement plus long, car l'espace vide doit également être rempli d'oxyde de carbone.
In this entire memorandum, no human beings were talked about. This essentially was talking about how we can change trucks to become effective mobile gas chambers. That's what they were talking about. And in the book, very early on in the book, I actually visit with my colleague Jay. We visit the little town in Switzerland where these trucks were manufactured. And again, that's one of the unknown stories of the Holocaust. They weren't made in Germany, they were made in Switzerland and exported.
Right.
And so we go to the little place in Switzerland, which I call the town of organised forgetting, and we interview people connected to Saurer, the company. That was a company still working today, not in trucks, but they're working in textile equipment today.
But the depersonalisation, just coming back to that idea of this language, because the army have to also do this, because we can't say we're shooting human beings, we have to say targets or whatever it might be, to be able to strip away any kind of conscience.
Any kind of human
And what
being.
you see in here is a totally stripped back and very sort of ruthlessly efficient way of delivering. This is how you deliver death.
Absolutely correct. And the thing about that is that could have almost been a historic document. It wasn't. It read to me like an entirely contemporary memorandum being sent from one business associate to another.
And this is coming back to the language.
That was to do with the language. So that was the first moment, forwarding on about 10 years. I was then one of the directors of an arts organisation called Platform.
Is this the second light bulb?
This is the second light bulb moment, mid-1990s, and we were starting to do work looking at the environmental and human rights impacts of companies. And we got word that in Nigeria, Shell were causing total environmental havoc. And as you may remember, at that time, there was an inspirational writer, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who started leading a Gandhian, non-violent resistance struggle. Amazingly effective. And 300,000 or 400,000 Ogonis came out. Shell had to withdraw, and the other oil companies, including Chevron, they had to withdraw from the Niger Delta. I mean, the destruction there was like something out of a film. There were these gas flarings, carbonising the landscape, going right through villages, destroying the fish, destroying the mangrove swamps.
Indigenous people have been cheated through laws such as are operated in Nigeria today, through political marginalization. They have driven certain people to death. In recovering the money that has been stolen from us, I do not want any blood spilt, not of an Ogoni man, not of any strangers amongst us. We are going to demand our rights peacefully, non-violently, and we shall win.
And then, of course, what happened in that, to kind of cut a long story short, is that Ken Saro-Wiwa became too dangerous for the Nigerian government and for Shell. He was framed, together with 8 colleagues, on completely fictitious charges. There was a kangaroo trial, and on the 10th of November 1995, he was executed. Those 9 men were executed in Port Harcourt. And that was the second moment where I thought, if you worked at Shell, if you worked at one of those oil companies and that had just happened, how would you just continue? Business as normal. You just go into work the next day at the Shell Centre here in London. You just carry on. What would you have to do to your mind to enable that sort of terrifying responsibility that your company has caused that kind of damage? And then 9 innocent people have been executed.
And then you still are able to go back to your desk.
You just go back to your desk and carry on. And I then really began to think that surely the secret connecting the Saurer memorandum, the secret of that and connecting what Shell and the Nigeria and Ken Saro-Wiwa, it must be to do with the psychology. It's something about our human psychology that enabled this process to happen. And the third moment happened just a few years later, in 97, I think it was. And you may remember the wonderful writer Gita Sereni,
yes,
who's done probably the greatest work on what we call perpetrator psychology. So in the 70s, she wrote a seminal book on Franz Stangl, the Treblinka commandant, Catholic, by the way, responsible for about 1 million people being killed at Treblinka. But the longest book she wrote was about Albert Speer. And
now, just for people who don't know, he's a sort of chief architect, Hitler's chief architect. Is that too grand?
Well, no, you're right. He started as Hitler's architect. More terrifyingly, really, he became then in the war in 1942. He was promoted and he became the Minister for Arms Production and Weapons Manufacture. And he was a brilliant organiser. Right. I mean, he was some historians say the war lasted an additional year because of Speer's organisational skills. So he has enormous responsibility. But Gita Sereni spent the last 2 years of Speer's life interviewing him. And it's a remarkable book because she really tries to get close to him. Historians feel maybe she got too close. I don't think so, because she was trying to lure him into being honest and finding out about what was going on in his mind. And in that book, there was one line in the book, and I suddenly thought, no, this is the third moment. This is the third light bulb moment, because this is the moment when I put everything together in a way the whole project really came together. Because Seren is interviewing him, and then he says this: Hitler required us not only to compartmentalize our activities, but also our thinking. He insisted that each man should only think about his task and not be concerned with that of his neighbour. And I suddenly thought that must be the key. It's compartmentalisation, and coming from the mouth of Speer. And then the second thing of Speer's that really impacted on me wasn't in Gita Sereni's work. It was actually in Speer's own autobiography, which I was then reading subsequently to reading the Sereni's book. And this one was perhaps even more extraordinary than that first quote, because I found the following quotation where Speer talks about writing to Hitler in 1944, when he's been leading the Nazi war machine, organising weapons. And Speer writes this to Hitler in 1944: "The task I have to fulfill is an unpolitical one. I have felt at ease in my work only so long as my person and my work were evaluated solely by the standard of practical accomplishments." And then Speer says, "Today it seems to me that I was trying to compartmentalise my mind." And that was the thing that then I realised that was the key to everything. And that links the three light bulbs together.
And brings us to today, because actually that could be written in corporate language or legalese.
Absolutely.
And say, actually, I just do this, and what happens down here, I bear no responsibility
Absolutely
for.
right.
And that really gets to the crux of the book, doesn't it?
It does. No, that's at the heart of the book. Because what I'm writing about, I wouldn't have spent all of this time, 22 years of thinking, 10 years of writing. I wouldn't have done that if I was writing a purely historic book. It would only be of value to academic historians. I want this book to speak to everybody in our society who's concerned about human rights, environment, corporate power today. I mean, activism, climate change. I mean, all of these things. You can find that compartmentalisation in everything in our world today.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc. Before we talk more about the desk killers with Dan Gretton, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up, we got a tweet from Dr. Brandon Brossard. War is killing. Organised mass murder, glorified with uniforms, justified by liars, with huge profits for bankers and politicians. Next up, from Occupy Wall Street, New York City, it's not a video game. PTSD is causing drone pilots to quit in record numbers. This is, when we could talk about in the context of desk killers.
Well, absolutely.
I mean, these people might be in a shipping container in a desert in Nevada.
They are. They're operating them from exactly that, from Nevada. I write about this in a very early point in the book. I think it's absolutely terrifying. They're advertising for some of these drone pilots now, using the language, "Do you enjoy playing video games?"
Next, from Rejoin and Reform, the fall in life expectancy is proof that austerity kills. It does. 150,000 unnecessary early deaths, and the whole thing was totally unnecessary. The work of silly boy men, Cameron and Osborne. Criminal, or should be.
It doesn't have to be in the context of warfare. It doesn't have to be in the context of an oil company. It could be in, the civil servants working in the Department of Social Security. And I think that figure of 150,000 is extrapolating from a 2014 study, which found in 1 year there'd been 30,000 deaths. It was a University of Oxford study, I believe. And again, in a vast bureaucracy, how do you account for responsibility in that way? And I think they're inevitable. Whether it's 30,000 or 50,000, there have been tens of thousands of deaths because of policies organised from Downing Street and the Treasury.
And finally, from the foreclosure, the banks destroy lives and plunder wealth with nothing more than photoshopped images and bulk white paper. $1 million profit can be generated from less than $10 of paper, ink, and postage. Computers and copiers are the weapons of middle-class destruction. When it comes to desk killers, let's talk about the banks. Because on this programme we've covered all of them. Forging signatures, repossessions, smashing businesses apart. Are they not stereotypical?
Well, I mean, banks and insurance companies were also at the heart of what I'm writing about here, particularly in history. One of the invisible sides of the Holocaust was, of course, that all the main German banks, Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, Allianz, the insurance company, I mean, these made enormous profits during the 12 years of Nazism. Their loans went to build the concentration camps and the extermination camps. Allianz were actually insuring camps, would you believe, at the height of the Holocaust. They had representatives going around checking up on their policies. I mean, these are, again, kind of invisible histories we're talking about here. That's another aspect of what I'm writing about. Whole histories that we haven't been looking at in the right way.
Which neatly brings us to our book of the week, which is a triumph. I mean, congratulations on it, but do just pitch it to us. I, you, we, them, Journeys Beyond Evil, the desk killers in history and today. Why should we read it?
If you're interested in humanity, psychology, history, genocide, human rights, read this book.
Congratulations on it.
Thank you.
There have been numerous books and films made about the Holocaust. One of the things that isn't really touched on, and one of the things that you have done brilliantly, is talk about the corporate history of this event.
Yep.
Walk us through it.
Actually, I'd like to start by reading a quotation from about how we look at history. And this quotation comes from the great writer W.G. Sebald. And in his last book, at the end of a description of a battle, he writes this: "Our concern with history is a concern with pre-formed images already printed on our brains, images at which we keep staring while the truth lies elsewhere, away from it all, somewhere as yet undiscovered." And that was such a brilliant line. And I'd already started the research on the book, and it led me straight into looking at this map we've got here. If we want to think about the truth lying somewhere elsewhere as yet undiscovered, just look at this image in some detail. It repays it. This is a contemporary map of the town of Auschwitz, which, of course, the Germans rechristened Auschwitz. When people go to this town, 99.9% of people go to this little area here, which is where the museum is.
Yes.
And where the famous arch Arbeit macht frei is.
Yeah.
And this was the original camp, the political camp. Only a minority of people go to Birkenau, which is where the gas chambers were, just about 1.5 kilometres to the west,
Yes.
here. And almost nobody, I mean, we're talking about maybe a few dozen people a year, actually make it over to this vast chemical site.
Right.
In the eastern part of Auschwitz. And this is where the second biggest corporation in the world, in 1942, who were IG Farben, who we know today as the companies like Bayer, Herbst, Agfa, and they created this massive factory at this place called Dvori. This is about 3 or 4 kilometers to the east. And this is where Primo Levi and Jean Emery and Elie Wiesel, they worked as slave labourers at a camp called Monowitz. Now, if you go here today, this site has been almost extinguished from history.
Right.
There's no memorialisation here at Monowitz. There's a tiny little memorial there that you can hardly see. And this is still working as a chemical factory today, a Polish chemical company. And I just think as an image of how we look at the Holocaust, this should be known by everybody interested in history.
And
because this is the corporate side.
But why have you given the corporate? Because if we're here and here, you've given this corporate side huge focus.
Well, it deserves huge focus.
Because ultimately what you're saying is that was the driver.
The entire Holocaust couldn't have happened without collusion between the corporations and the Nazi state. I mean, this concentration camp at Monowitz, this was what we would call today a public-private partnership. It was funded by IG Farben, and the labour was supplied by the Nazi, governed by the SS. It was essentially a private partnership between the SS and IG Farben. And this is not known. This is not widely known about.
In today's terms, is a PFI deal.
Totally, yes.
Again, you bring the book back to the relevance of today and the importance. Because what you're constantly doing is saying, look, this historical context, there's nothing new here. And we can slide very, very quickly, and possibly are sliding, into this kind of thinking again.
I mean, it's all around us. I mean, a few weeks ago, I don't know if you saw in the newspapers, these two American psychologists were on trial giving evidence, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen. These are the psychologists, medical men, who came up with the criteria that enabled people to be tortured, the enhanced interrogation program under Bush in the early 2000s.
And this is at Guantanamo?
This is at Guantanamo and at other sites, actually, around the world. And there's a whole chapter in the book where I talk about lawyers working in Washington who are sending memoranda to each other, not dissimilar to the Sauer memoranda, which is about how we can torture people without using the word torture. Two highly educated legal brains. And so all the time in this book, I'm saying it's not only about looking at history in a totally different way, it's also about looking at our world and seeing these patterns of behaviour everywhere. Government departments, pharmaceutical companies, oil companies, lawyers in Washington.
There are 10 planks, if you like, or principles that ultimately you've distilled this wonderful piece of work, not down to, but have come out of it. What are they? Just run us through a few.
Well, a few of them. I mean, in fact, in this book, I flag up there are 10. This has come out of 20 years of thinking.
Yes.
And I wanted to give readers a way of being able to kind of try and get a handle on how we can break down this kind of psychological process.
And I just didn't want to ask that question.
No.
Like, sum it up in one sentence.
Well, you can't. That's almost impossible. Yeah. But there are things like, for instance, I talk about incrementalism, the tiny steps by which quite a decent, humane individual can become corrupted. And I give examples in the book. I mean, looking at Stangl, say, the Treblinka commandant, there are 22 little steps by which he goes from being, quite an idealistic boy to being the commandant of Treblinka. And that's an amazing thing. I also, in the book, I interview really, really senior former oil executives and energy executives who are now retired. It took a year to set some of those interviews up. And the most extraordinary thing is I was asking them to track themselves from being the child who was interested in geography and geology, very idealistic about the world, to being the lawyer who worked at Shell at the time that Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed. And that process, again, step by step by step by step by step,
and this is
where people get involved in these massive organisations.
But it doesn't happen overnight. You're saying that incremental
many years.
And by osmosis, because of the culture within that organisation.
Absolutely, yeah.
What else?
And there are other things like peer conformity. If you see other people all around you accepting things as normal, whether that's the people in the drones in Nevada, people working on the drones, or whether you're talking about the doctors who are working at Auschwitz selecting people. I mean, doctors on the ramps selecting who would go to the gas chamber, who wouldn't, who took the Hippocratic Oath. So peer conformity is vital. Dehumanisation of language, distancing yourself from the act of violence. There's also things about workaholism, what I call the narcissism of frenzy, when people are working at such high speeds. They're not actually tracking the ethics of what they're doing anymore. And then, of course, looking away or willful ignorance. I mean, that perhaps is one of the underpinning ones of actually not looking. And again, in this context, there are two remarkable examples I can give of this looking away. One of them was with Speer. Speer had a total crisis in late 43. For one of the only times in his life, he leaves the office in Berlin, and he goes to Dora, which was an underground massive factory where they were making the V2 rockets. And it's terrifying for Speer, because he's no longer at his desk, and he's looking into the eyes of the slave labourers. And there are bodies piled up at the side. And after this moment, Speer has a total breakdown, physical and mental. He's away for weeks. He goes up to Finland to try and recover. He's then in hospital for weeks in Germany. And that's the moment in January, February 44, where he suddenly sees Hitler as totally insane. And the other example with this is a friend of mine who does a lot of work on oil companies, was recently interviewing the chief exec of Shell, Dutchman, and they were talking about Nigeria. And quite fascinatingly, he said, Shell don't send people to Nigeria. Because? Wow. The senior people? Because if the senior people see with their own eyes what is going on there, if you see, you have responsibility. One of the things that really I found troubling in the 90s, particularly after the Shell Saro-Wiwa stuff happened, you may remember there was this term that started being used about 96, 97, corporate social responsibility, and it's still used. you know. And more I think about it, I think there's a huge problem, and I think we need to move totally away from that idea of corporate social responsibility. CSR. Because what that does is it essentially lets corporations off the hook. If you think about it, in a large organisation like an oil company, if you have a CSR department, that takes away almost all of your responsibility if you're out in the field in Nigeria. Because you think, oh, well, the CSR people, they're sorting out. They're doing the ethics. We don't have to worry about it.
So what do you want to replace it with?
I want to replace it with, I think people should be held individually accountable for the actions they take in corporations. I mean, I've got minutes of Shell meetings at the time that Sarawi was executed. I know the names of all of those people who were at those meetings the day before. And those people one day will be in The Hague. Those people one day will be being held individually responsible for their corporate crimes. And that's absolutely as it should be. I mean, there was a great activist, because we're now, you know, this relates directly to the kind of climate catastrophe around us all. You know, I mean, the desk killers are massively involved in that as well. And I was very arrested by this phrase that comes from an activist called Utah Phillips in America. And he said, the planet is not dying, it is being killed. And the people killing it have names and addresses.
These 10 principles, thoughts, depict the modern workplace quite well.
Pretty much, yeah.
So the desk killer is alive and well.
They're all around us.
How, when someone's watching this programme, how do you begin to, because that's terrifying, right? So what's the one thing that we can do? Is the first thing...
Well, the flippant answer is read this book.
Of course, but is the first thing just to read the book and then become aware of this willful ignorance, of the way these people go about their work?
Everything starts with awareness. Everything starts with awareness and education. Everything. So that's the beginning point.
Can I just say congratulations on this book?
Thank you.
And I know there's a lot more work to do, but your undertaking has been massive, and you've delivered it so beautifully.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming by.
Thanks so much.
That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently, but until then, stay curious.
I want this book to speak to everybody in our society who's concerned about human rights, environment, corporate power today, activism, climate change. You can find that compartmentalisation in everything in our world.